Case 1. Kristen Rossum. The toxicologist, who worked at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, knew exactly where her husband's body would be sent for autopsy. On the evening of November 6, 2000, Kristen Rossum called 911 from her apartment on Rosemont Street in La Jolla and reported that she had found her husband dead. When paramedics arrived, they discovered 26-year-old Gregory DeVillers lying on the bed, rose petals scattered across his body, a wedding photograph placed carefully on his chest. The scene was staged to look like a romantic suicide, an aesthetic borrowed directly from the film American Beauty. What investigators would discover was that Kristen had poisoned Gregory with a massive dose of fentanyl stolen from the very lab where she worked, and that the murder was designed to prevent him from exposing her affair and her theft of methamphetamine from the county's drug storage. Kristen Margreta Rossum was born on October 25, 1976, in Memphis, Tennessee, and was raised in Claremont, California, in a highly educated and affluent household. Her father, Ralph, was a college professor. Her mother, Constance, worked in higher education. Kristen had 2 brothers. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemistry from San Diego State University and became a certified forensic toxicologist. By 2000, she was 24 years old and working at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, a position that gave her access to some of the most lethal substances in existence. She had married Gregory DeVillers in 1999. To those who knew her, Kristen appeared to be a golden girl with a prestigious career and a perfect marriage. That image concealed a methamphetamine addiction that had begun in high school and an affair with her boss, Dr. Michael Robertson, that had started by the summer of 2000. Gregory T. DeVillers was 26 years old when he was killed. He worked in the biotech industry and was a college graduate. He was well-liked, hard-working, and deeply trusted by his friends and family. He was survived by his parents and his brothers, Jerome and Craig. Gregory had been devoted to Kristen and had trusted her implicitly, especially on matters related to medical care and health. In early November 2000, he discovered that Kristen had relapsed into methamphetamine addiction and was having an affair with Dr. Robertson. Gregory made a decision that would cost him his life. He told Kristen that he intended to confront her employers at the medical examiner's office and report her theft of methamphetamine from the lab. The exposure would have destroyed her career and resulted in prison time. Between November 1st and November 6th, 2000, Kristen Rossum executed a plan to murder her husband. On November 1st, Gregory confronted her about the affair and threatened to report her drug theft. Over the next 4 days, Gregory was confined to bed, complaining of severe lethargy. Investigators would later believe that Kristen had been slipping him sedatives during this period. In the days before November 6th, Kristen stole fentanyl from the medical examiner's lab. Fentanyl is a powerful opioid used in anesthesia and pain management, and it is lethal in even small doses. On the afternoon of November 6th, Kristen went to work as usual. During her lunch break, she stopped at a grocery store and purchased rose petals. She returned to the apartment on Rosemont Street in the late afternoon. At some point that evening, she administered a lethal combination of fentanyl, clonazepam, and oxycodone to Gregory. Before calling 911 at 9:22 p.m., she scattered the rose petals over his body and placed their wedding photograph on his chest. When police arrived, she told them that Gregory had been depressed and suicidal over their marital problems and that she had found him dead when she came home. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Gregory had been dead for hours. The cover story began to unravel almost immediately. Gregory's brothers, Jerome and Craig, told police that their brother was not suicidal and that he hated drugs. Investigators found the rose petals and the wedding photograph, and they recovered a grocery receipt that had been time-stamped during Kristen's lunch break. The receipt proved that she had purchased the rose petals hours before calling 911, which dismantled her claim that she had simply discovered his body. Toxicology tests, conducted ironically by Kristen's own workplace, revealed an extraordinarily high and lethal dose of fentanyl in Gregory's blood, along with clonazepam. Forensic investigators found Kristen's DNA on the fentanyl packaging. The investigation also exposed a catastrophic failure at the medical examiner's office. The facility had zero inventory control over its drug standards, and Kristen had been stealing methamphetamine for months without anyone noticing. The investigation lasted 7 months. On June 25, 2001, Kristen Rossum was arrested in San Diego and charged with first-degree murder with the special circumstance of poisoning. Prosecutor Dan Goldstein handled the case. Defense attorney Terry McCarthy represented Kristen. She was initially held without bail, though bail was later set at $1.25 million. The death penalty was sought initially, but was dropped before trial. The trial began in October 2002 in San Diego County Superior Court and lasted 1 month. Judge John M. Thompson presided. Prosecutor Goldstein portrayed Kristen as a manipulative addict who had used her specialized knowledge of toxicology to commit what she believed would be the perfect murder. He presented the jury with the DNA evidence linking her to the fentanyl packaging, the grocery receipt that destroyed her timeline, and testimony from Jerome and Craig that Gregory had not been suicidal. The prosecution also emphasized the American Beauty staging, arguing that Kristen had borrowed the visual aesthetic of rose petals from the film to create a romanticized suicide scene. The defense argued that Gregory had committed suicide out of despair over the failing marriage, and that he had stolen the drugs from Kristen's own stash. The argument failed. The evidence was overwhelming. Kristen did not testify. On November 12, 2002, the jury convicted Kristen Rossum of first-degree murder. On December 12, 2002, Judge John M. Thompson sentenced Kristen Rossum to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gregory's brothers spoke passionately about the betrayal and the loss of their kind-hearted brother. They emphasized the trust Gregory had placed in Kristen, particularly on matters involving medicine and health. Kristen addressed the court briefly and maintained her innocence. "I did not kill my husband," she said. No remorse was expressed. Kristen filed multiple appeals based on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, arguing that her lawyers had not properly challenged the fentanyl testing methods. In 2010, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied her habeas corpus petition. All appeals have been exhausted. The conviction has been upheld at every level. Gregory's family pursued a landmark civil wrongful death lawsuit against San Diego County, arguing that the county's negligence in failing to audit and secure lethal drugs had enabled Kristen to commit murder. Kristen Rossum is 49 years old. She is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she is serving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her inmate number is W98031. She will never be released. The irony of her case is inescapable. She murdered her husband using poison, knowing that his body would be sent to the exact forensic lab where she worked. The rose petals she scattered to stage a romantic suicide became evidence that helped convict her. The grocery receipt, time-stamped at 12:35 p.m. on the day of the murder, proved that she had been planning the scene while Gregory was still alive. Case 2. Dr. Robert Ferrante. The world-renowned neurobiologist who had dedicated his career to researching Lou Gehrig's disease convinced his wife to drink poison by telling her it would help her conceive a second child. Dr. Robert Ferrante was 64 years old in April 2013, and he was the co-director of the Center for ALS Research at the University of Pittsburgh. He and his wife, Dr. Autumn Klein, were a medical power couple with a combined household income of more than $500,000 per year. On the evening of April 17, 2013, Ferrante laced a creatine supplement drink with potassium cyanide and told Autumn that the mixture was a special formulation designed to enhance her fertility treatments. She trusted him. She drank it. 3 days later, she was dead. The motive was a combination of extreme jealousy, a need for control, and the financial benefit of collecting her life insurance rather than losing assets in a divorce. Robert George Ferrante was born in 1948 in Boston, Massachusetts. He came from a working-class background, but rose to extreme academic prominence through intelligence and ambition. He earned a PhD in neurobiology and became one of the most respected researchers in the field of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Before joining the University of Pittsburgh, he had worked at Harvard Medical School. He was revered in the medical community as a pioneer. Ferrante had been married before and had 2 adult children from his previous marriage. His second wife was Dr. Autumn Klein, and together they had a 6-year-old daughter. By 2013, the marriage had begun to deteriorate. Autumn was privately complaining to friends about Ferrante's controlling nature and was contemplating divorce. Ferrante suspected that she was having an affair with a colleague. He had no criminal record and no history of formal mental health diagnoses, but those who knew him described him as obsessive and domineering. Dr. Autumn Klein was 41 years old when she died. She held both an MD and a PhD and served as the chief of women's neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. She was a beloved doctor, a highly respected academic, and a woman known for her deep empathy with patients. She was the mother of a 6-year-old daughter. In the spring of 2013, Autumn was undergoing strenuous in vitro fertilization treatments in an effort to have a second child. The treatments were physically and emotionally exhausting. She was also wrestling with the question of whether to leave her marriage. Friends later told investigators that Autumn had confided in them about Ferrante's controlling behavior and had been seriously considering divorce. A memorial fund, the Dr. Autumn Klein Memorial Fund, was established after her death to support women in the field of neurology. On April 15, 2013, 2 days before Autumn Klein collapsed, Robert Ferrante used his university lab credentials and an overnight shipping account to order 250 grams of potassium cyanide. The chemical had absolutely no legitimate use in his specific ALS research lab. In the days leading up to April 17th, Ferrante conducted Google searches for the terms cyanide poisoning. On the late evening of April 17th, in their upscale home on Lytton Avenue in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Ferrante prepared what he told Autumn was a creatine supplement drink. He claimed that it was a special formulation that would help her IVF treatments succeed. Autumn trusted his medical expertise. She drank it. The cyanide took effect almost immediately. Ferrante called 911 and reported that his wife had suddenly collapsed. When paramedics arrived, Autumn was gasping for air. Ferrante made no attempt to render medical aid, despite being a highly trained scientist. On April 20th, 2013, Autumn Klein was pronounced dead. After her death, Ferrante strongly opposed an autopsy and pressured the medical examiner to quickly cremate her body. The investigation began when a sharp-eyed doctor at the hospital noticed that Autumn's blood was an exceptionally bright red color, a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. The doctor ordered a highly unusual test for cyanide. The results came back days later and showed lethal levels of the poison in her system. investigators obtained Ferrante's Google search history and found searches for cyanide poisoning, and later, how to remove searches from Google. They also obtained records from the university's chemical procurement system, which showed that Ferrante had ordered 250 grams of potassium cyanide with overnight shipping just 2 days before Autumn's collapse. The chemical had no legitimate use in his lab. The most damning piece of evidence was the 911 tape. On the recording, Ferrante can be heard fake crying while Autumn audibly gasps for air in the background. He makes no attempt to save her life. The investigation lasted 3 months. On July 25, 2013, Ferrante was arrested in West Virginia while traveling. He was charged with criminal homicide. Prosecutor Lisa Pellegrini handled the case. Defense attorney William Defenderfer represented Ferrante. He was denied bond. The trial began in October 2014 in Allegheny County Courthouse. Judge Jeffrey A. Manning presided over the jury trial. The prosecution presented Ferrante's Google searches, the unauthorized laboratory purchase of cyanide, and the chilling 911 tape. Prosecutors argued that Ferrante had murdered Autumn because he suspected her of having an affair and because he wanted to collect her life insurance rather than face a costly divorce. The defense claimed that Autumn had suffered a sudden cardiac event and that the hospital's cyanide test was either a false positive or the result of contaminated samples. The defense attempted to explain the cyanide procurement as a legitimate research need, but the argument was undermined by the fact that Ferrante's lab had no use for the chemical. The jury was not persuaded. On November 7, 2014, Robert Ferrante was convicted of first-degree murder. On February 4, 2015, Robert Ferrante was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Autumn's parents spoke at the sentencing hearing about the agony of losing their brilliant daughter and about the betrayal by a man they had welcomed into their family. They spoke of Autumn's dedication to her patients and her love for their granddaughter. Ferrante has exhausted all state appeals, and his conviction has been upheld at every level. Robert Ferrante is 77 years old. He is incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution in Houtsdale, Pennsylvania, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The betrayal at the heart of this case is staggering. Ferrante weaponized Autumn's desire to have a baby, the most intimate and vulnerable hope of their marriage, and used it to murder her. Despite his genius-level intelligence, his arrogance led him to create a digital trail that investigators followed directly to him. After Googling cyanide poisoning, he Googled how to remove searches from Google. The Dr. Autumn Klein Memorial Fund continues to support women in neurology, ensuring that her legacy of care and brilliance endures. Case 3. A.N. Miller-Konz, the research chemist at GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, used her access to poison to murder her husband, a pediatric AIDS researcher who had dedicated his life to saving children. Ann Miller was 26 years old in late 2000, and she worked as a bench chemist at the company's Research Triangle Park facility in North Carolina. Her husband, Dr. Eric Miller, was 30 years old and worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of North Carolina, where he studied treatments for children with AIDS. The marriage appeared perfect. The couple was wealthy, active in their local church, and raising an infant daughter. What no one knew was that Anne was having a secret affair with a coworker named Daryl Willard, and that she had begun poisoning Eric with arsenic in an effort to escape the marriage without the social stigma of divorce or the financial cost of splitting their assets. The case would take 4 years to solve and would make national legal history when the North Carolina Supreme Court pierced attorney-client privilege for a deceased client in order to secure a murder conviction. Ann Amanda Miller was born in 1974 in North Carolina and was raised in a wealthy and prominent family. She graduated from Purdue University with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and returned to North Carolina to work as a research chemist at Glaxo Wellcome in Research Triangle Park. She married Dr. Eric Miller, and the couple had one daughter who was an infant at the time of the crime. Anne and Eric were both highly educated professionals, living in an affluent dual-income household. They were actively involved in their local church and were seen by their community as a perfect young couple. The reality was different. By late 2000, Anne had begun a secret affair with Daryl Willard, a co-worker at Glaxo Wellcome. She wanted to be with Willard, but she did not want to face the social consequences of divorce or the financial burden of splitting the marital assets. She had no criminal record before the murder. Dr. Eric Miller was 30 years old when he died. He held a PhD and worked as a postdoctoral pediatric AIDS researcher at the University of North Carolina. He was a highly respected scientist whose work focused on finding treatments for children suffering from HIV and AIDS. He was beloved by his colleagues and his family. He was the father of a newborn daughter. In the fall of 2000, Eric was at the pinnacle of his academic career, conducting research that had the potential to save the lives of children around the world. He had no idea that his wife was poisoning him. Throughout late 2000, Anne Miller systematically poisoned her husband with arsenic. She used her position at Glaxo Wellcome to procure the poison, circumventing the pharmaceutical company's safety protocols. She laced Eric's food and drinks with heavy doses of arsenic, including beer that he took with him on a bowling trip. On November 15, 2000, Eric was hospitalized with severe gastrointestinal symptoms and neurological decline. His doctors were baffled by the illness. Shortly before his death, a heavy metals panel was ordered. The results showed lethal amounts of arsenic in his system. On December 2, 2000, Eric Miller died. The cause of death was arsenic poisoning. Investigators quickly identified Anne Miller and her lover, Daryl Willard, as suspects. Evidence showed that Willard had used his own work computer at Glaxo Wellcome to research arsenic poisoning. But the investigation stalled. There was suspicion, but not enough evidence to bring charges. The break in the case came in January 2001, when Daryl Willard committed suicide. Before his death, Willard confessed to his attorney that Anne Miller had poisoned Eric. The confession presented a significant legal problem. Attorney-client privilege typically survives the death of the client, meaning that the attorney could not be compelled to reveal what Willard had told him. Prosecutors fought the issue all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. In a landmark ruling, the court held that the need for justice in a capital murder case outweighed the confidentiality of a dead man's confession. It was the first time in North Carolina history that the Supreme Court had pierced attorney-client privilege for a deceased client. The ruling allowed the attorney's testimony to be used as evidence. The investigation lasted 4 years, from Eric's death to Anne's arrest. In September 2004, Anne Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutor Colin Willoughby handled the case. Defense attorney Joseph Cheshire represented Anne. Rather than face a highly publicized trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Anne Miller accepted a plea deal. In November 2005, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Arsenic had been found in Eric's body. Willard's computer searches for arsenic poisoning had been documented. The attorney's testimony, now admissible thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, directly implicated her. On the sentencing date in November 2005, Anne Miller was sentenced to 25 to 31 years in state prison. Anne Miller Kantz is 51 years old. She is incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Her projected release date is 2029, at which point she will have served approximately 25 years. The case made national legal history and established a precedent that the need for justice in a capital murder case can outweigh the confidentiality protections of attorney-client privilege, even after the client's death. Eric Miller was a scientist who dedicated his life to saving children with AIDS. His wife used her own scientific knowledge to brutally end his life. The legal ruling that emerged from his death ensures that his case will be studied in law schools for generations. Case 4. Tianle Li. The chemist who had worked at Bristol Myers Squibb for 10 years visited her husband in the hospital each day, bringing him food as he lay dying from thallium poisoning. What the nurses did not know was that the food was laced with the same heavy metal poison that had put him there. Tianle Li was 40 years old in January 2011, and she had been married to Xiaoye Wang, a 39-year-old computer software engineer, for more than a decade. The couple had a 2-year-old son. The marriage had deteriorated, and Wang had filed for divorce due to domestic abuse. He had called the police on Li previously after she had physically assaulted him. As Wang prepared to move out and finalize the divorce, Li decided that she would rather see him dead than see him take half of their assets. She ordered thallium through her employer's chemical procurement system, poisoned him progressively over the course of weeks, and continued to administer the poison even after he was hospitalized and fighting for his life. Tianle Li was born in 1971 in China and immigrated to the United States to pursue her education. She earned a master's degree in chemistry and was hired as a chemist at Bristol Myers Squibb, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. She worked there for 10 years. She married Xiaoye Wang, and the couple lived in Monroe Township, New Jersey. They had one son who was 2 years old at the time of the crime. Li and Wang lived in an affluent dual-income household, but the marriage was troubled. Friends described Li as highly intelligent but intensely private and prone to extreme fits of rage. By 2010, the relationship had become abusive. Wang had called the police on multiple occasions to report that Li had physically assaulted him. In early 2011, Wang filed for divorce and was preparing to move out of the home. The impending divorce and the prospect of splitting their assets became the motive for murder. Li had no criminal record before the crime. Xiaoye Wang was 39 years old when he died. He was a computer software engineer who was highly educated, well-liked, and hardworking. He was active in his church community and was the father of a 2-year-old son. Wang had been the victim of domestic violence throughout the marriage and had taken legal steps to protect himself by filing for divorce. He was preparing to move out of the home he shared with Li and to establish a custody arrangement for their son. He had no reason to believe that the meals and beverages his wife prepared for him were laced with poison. His vulnerability was that he still lived in the same home with Li and trusted that she would not harm the father of her child. In December 2010, Tianle Li placed an order for 4 bottles of thallium through her employer's chemical procurement system at Bristol Myers Squibb. She had no legitimate business need for the chemical. She also used her work computer to research thallium toxicity. Between late December 2010 and January 14, 2011, Li began poisoning Wang by lacing his food and drinks with thallium. Thallium is a heavy metal that causes severe symptoms, including gastrointestinal distress, neurological damage, and hair loss. On January 14, 2011, Wang checked into Princeton Medical Center with severe stomach pains, numbness, and hair loss. His doctors were baffled by the symptoms. During his hospitalization, Li visited him daily and brought him food. She continued to poison him while he was in the hospital, ensuring that his condition would not improve. On January 25, 2011, a nurse who had worked at the hospital remembered a thallium poisoning case from the 1990s in China. She suggested that the doctors test Wang for thallium. The results came back positive, showing lethal levels of the poison in his system. On January 26, 2011, before an antidote could be administered, Xiaoye Wang died. Immediately after his death, Li booked one-way flights to China for herself and her 2-year-old son. Hospital toxicology confirmed thallium poisoning shortly before Wang's death. Investigators moved quickly. They obtained records from Bristol-Myers Squibb, showing that Li had personally ordered 4 bottles of thallium through the company's procurement system. She had no legitimate reason to order the chemical. Investigators also found that Li had used her work computer to search for information on thallium toxicity. Previous police reports documented a pattern of domestic violence in which Wang had been the victim of Li's physical assaults. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Li. In February 2011, just weeks after Wang's death, Tianlei Li was arrested in New Jersey before she could flee to China. She was charged with first-degree murder and hindering apprehension. Prosecutor Christy Bavacqua handled the case. Defense attorney Stephen Altman represented Li. She was held on $4.15 million bail. She pleaded not guilty. The trial began in June 2013 in Middlesex County Superior Court. Judge Michael Toto presided over the jury trial. The prosecution argued that Li was the only person with the motive, the means, and the specialized scientific access necessary to procure thallium and administer it to Wang. Prosecutors presented the Bristol-Myers Squibb procurement records, showing that Li had personally ordered the exact poison that killed her husband. They presented her work computer searches for thallium toxicity. They presented evidence that she had booked one-way flights to China immediately after Wang's death, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. The defense argued that Wang may have poisoned himself out of distress over the divorce, or that a coworker had poisoned him. The argument was not persuasive. The evidence was overwhelming. On July 9, 2013, the jury convicted Tianlei Li of first-degree murder. On September 30, 2013, Tianlei Li was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 62 years before she would be eligible for parole. She was 42 years old at the time of sentencing. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 104 years old, making the sentence an effective life term. Tianlei Li is 55 years old. She is incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. The most disturbing fact of this case is that Li slowly poisoned her husband while he was hospitalized, visiting him daily and bringing laced food as his condition deteriorated despite the best efforts of medical professionals. She used her prestigious pharmaceutical job as a cover to acquire the murder weapon. Their 2-year-old son lost both parents, one to murder and one to prison. Case 5, Dr. Yazid Essa. The emergency room physician watched his wife leave their home in Highland Heights, Ohio, on the evening of February 24, 2005, to drive to a movie theater. Minutes later, the calcium supplement he had convinced her to take began to kill her. Dr. Yazid Essa was 36 years old and worked as a board-certified ER doctor at Akron General Medical Center. He was wealthy, respected, and living in an upscale suburb of Cleveland. He was also having multiple affairs with nurses and wanted to avoid a costly divorce. Essa had emptied his wife's calcium capsules and refilled them with potassium cyanide. Rosemarie Essa took the pill, climbed into her SUV, and began driving. The cyanide took effect within minutes. She lost consciousness at the wheel and crashed her vehicle at low speed into another car. The crash was initially treated as a fatal accident. The autopsy revealed that she had not died from trauma. She had died from cyanide poisoning. By the time investigators identified Essa as the killer, he had fled the country and was living a lavish lifestyle in Lebanon under a false identity. Having completely abandoned his 2 young children, in the United States. Yazid Essa was born in 1968. He earned his medical degree and became a board-certified emergency room physician. He worked at Akron General Medical Center and was well compensated for his work. He was married to Rosemarie Essa, and the couple had 2 young children. Essa lived in Highland Heights, an upscale suburb of Cleveland, and projected an image of success and respectability. By early 2005, Essa was having multiple affairs with nurses he worked with at the hospital. Rosemarie had begun to suspect his infidelity and was considering leaving him. Essa did not want to go through a divorce that would split the family's assets and damage his reputation. He had no criminal record before the murder. Rosemarie Essa was 38 years old when she died. She was a former nurse and the mother of 2 young children. She had begun to suspect that her husband was having affairs and was contemplating leaving the marriage. She trusted Essa's medical expertise, and when he suggested that she take a specific calcium supplement to improve her health, she believed him. That trust cost her her life. Months before February 24, 2005, Yazid Essa procured potassium cyanide from a friend who worked in a jewelry manufacturing lab. Cyanide is used in certain jewelry manufacturing processes, and Essa exploited that access to obtain a lethal dose. He emptied Rosemarie's calcium capsules and carefully refilled them with cyanide. On the evening of February 24th, Rosemarie was preparing to drive to a movie theater. Before she left, she took what she believed was her calcium supplement. She climbed into her SUV and began driving. Within minutes, the cyanide took effect. She lost consciousness at the wheel. The SUV crashed at low speed into another vehicle. Emergency responders arrived and attempted to resuscitate her, but she was pronounced dead. The crash appeared to be a tragic accident. The autopsy revealed something that did not match the accident scene. Rosemarie had suffered no fatal trauma from the crash. Toxicology tests were ordered, and the results showed massive amounts of cyanide in her system. Investigators searched the Essa home and found the laced calcium pills. The evidence pointed directly to Yazid Essa. When investigators attempted to question him, they discovered that he had disappeared. Essa had fled the country and made his way to Lebanon, where he lived under a false identity. He spent more than a year living a lavish lifestyle in Lebanon, completely abandoning his 2 young children in the United States. An international manhunt ensued. In October 2006, Essa was tracked to Cyprus while he was traveling. He was arrested and eventually extradited to the United States in 2009. The trial began in January 2010 in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. The prosecution presented the laced calcium pills that had been found in the Essa home, evidence of Essa's procurement of cyanide from the jewelry manufacturing contact, and testimony from 2 of Essa's mistresses. The mistresses testified about his affairs and his desire to leave the marriage. The most damaging testimony came from Essa's own brother, who told the court that Essa had confessed to the murder while hiding in Lebanon. According to the brother, Essa said he had killed Rosemarie simply because she, quote, "sicks him too much." Essa's immediate flight from the country demonstrated consciousness of guilt. In March 2010, Yazid Essa was convicted of aggravated murder. Yazid Essa was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 20 years. He is currently 56 years old and is incarcerated in Ohio. The lies Essa told are staggering. He confessed to his brother that he killed his wife because she nagged him too much, reducing the murder of a woman and the destruction of a family to a trivial annoyance. After the murder, he spent over a year living a lavish lifestyle in Lebanon. Under an alias, completely abandoning his 2 children in the United States. The children lost their mother to murder and their father to prison. Case 6. Raymond Clark III. The doctoral student at Yale University was 5 days away from her wedding when a coworker strangled her in a high-security research laboratory and shoved her body into a wall cavity behind the plumbing. Annie Lee was 24 years old and was pursuing her PhD in pharmacology at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. On the morning of September 8, 2009, she swiped her keycard into the basement laboratory at 10 Amistad Street in New Haven, Connecticut, and began her work. She never swiped out. Raymond Clark III, a 24-year-old animal research technician who worked in the same lab, attacked her, strangled her, and used his intimate knowledge of the facility's architecture to conceal her body in a space that only someone familiar with the lab's infrastructure would know existed. The motive was workplace friction. Clark was reportedly angry over how Lee handled the lab mice, viewing her actions as a breach of protocol. 5 days later, on what should have been her wedding day, investigators found Annie Lou's body in the wall. Raymond John Clark III was 24 years old at the time of the murder. He was a high school graduate who had received specialized training to work as an animal research technician at Yale University's Animal Resources Center. He was engaged to be married. Those who worked with him described Clark as a strict and sometimes overbearing enforcer of lab rules. He was meticulous about protocols, particularly those involving the handling of laboratory animals, and he became agitated when he believed those protocols were not being followed. He had no criminal record. The tension between Clark and Liu had been building over what Clark perceived as her improper handling of the lab mice. Annie Lee was 24 years old when she was killed. She was a doctoral student in pharmacology at Yale University, one of the most competitive and prestigious programs in the country. She was accomplished, driven, and on the path to a successful career in science. She was 5 days away from her wedding. She and her fiancé had planned the ceremony, sent the invitations, and were finalizing the last details. On September 8, 2009, Annie went to the lab to complete routine work. She had no reason to believe that she would not return home that day. On the morning of September 8, 2009, Annie Lee swiped her keycard into the high-security laboratory at 10 Amistad Street at 10 a.m. She entered the basement facility where she and Raymond Clark both worked. Clark attacked her inside the lab and strangled her. After killing her, Clark used his intimate knowledge of the facility's architecture to conceal her body. He shoved her body upside down into a wall cavity behind the plumbing in the basement. The space was hidden and accessible only to someone who understood the lab's infrastructure. That evening, when Annie did not return home, her fiancé reported her missing. The timing was alarming. She was 5 days away from her wedding. It was completely out of character for her to disappear. Yale University Police and New Haven Police immediately began searching for Annie Lee. Investigators reviewed the keycard swipe data for the building, which tracked exactly which rooms individuals entered and exited, and at what times. The data showed that Annie Lee and Raymond Clark had been the only two people in the vicinity of the lab at the time of her disappearance. When investigators searched the facility, they found blood-stained clothing belonging to Clark, hidden in the ceiling tiles of the lab. Forensic analysis revealed DNA matching both Clark and Lee on a green pen and on a bloody sock. Clark had visible scratches on his face. On September 13, 2009, 5 days after Annie disappeared, and on what was supposed to be her wedding day, investigators found her body in the wall cavity. Raymond Clark was arrested on September 17, 2009, just outside the Science Building. He was charged with murder and initially pleaded not guilty. Rather than proceed to trial, Raymond Clark accepted an offered plea in June 2011. An offered plea allows a defendant to plead guilty while not admitting to all the facts of the case, acknowledging only that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. On June 3, 2011, Clark was sentenced to 44 years in prison. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. The keycard data was irrefutable, proving that he and Annie had been alone in the area. The DNA evidence, the blood-stained clothing, and the scratches on his face left no room for reasonable doubt. The body had been found in a location that only someone with intimate knowledge of the lab could have known about. Raymond Clark III is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at Cheshire Correctional Institution in Connecticut, where he will remain for decades. Annie Lee was 5 days away from her wedding when she was killed. The crime took place in a sterile, highly secure Ivy League research facility, a setting that contrasts violently with the brutal nature of the murder. Clark exploited the security and privacy of a restricted biological research laboratory to commit and conceal a homicide. The dispute that led to Annie's death was over. How she handled the lab mice. The triviality of the motive makes the loss all the more incomprehensible. Case 7. Dr. Mark Wangler. The anesthesiologist, whose entire career had been built on administering gases to unconscious patients, weaponized that exact expertise to murder his sleeping wife. Dr. Mark Wangler was 51 years old in September 2006, and he was a highly paid anesthesiologist working in Lima, Ohio. He and his wife, Kathy, had been married for years, but the relationship had deteriorated to the point where they slept in separate bedrooms. Kathy was 48 years old and worked as a homemaker. By the fall of 2006, the couple was headed toward divorce, and Wangler was facing financial ruin. He was also concerned about maintaining his standing in his conservative church community, where divorce carried social stigma. On the night of September 4th, 2006, Wangler routed carbon monoxide from the exhaust of an engine directly into the heating duct that fed into Kathy's bedroom. She died in her sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning. Wangler then called 911 and claimed that he was a victim of a faulty water heater, acting as though he had narrowly escaped the same fate. Dr. Mark Wangler was 51 years old at the time of the murder. He held a medical degree and was a board-certified anesthesiologist. His work involved the precise administration of gases to patients undergoing surgery, and he had spent decades mastering the science of how gases affect the human body. He was wealthy and well compensated for his medical expertise. He was married to Kathy Wangler, but by 2006, the marriage was deeply troubled. The couple had reached the point where they were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Wangler was facing the prospect of a costly divorce that would split the marital assets and diminish his financial standing. He was also concerned about how a divorce would affect his reputation in his conservative church community. The financial and social pressures became the motive for murder. Wangler had no criminal record before the crime. Kathy Wangler was 48 years old when she died. She was a homemaker who had been married to Mark Wangler for many years. The marriage had become troubled, and the couple had reached the point where they were no longer sharing a bedroom. Kathy slept alone in a bedroom that had its own heating vent connected to the home's HVAC system. That vulnerability, sleeping alone in a room with a dedicated vent, made her an easy target for a man who understood how to deliver lethal gases. On the night of September 4th, 2006, Dr. Mark Wangler executed a plan that required specific knowledge of both gases and HVAC systems. He routed carbon monoxide from the exhaust of an engine, likely a generator or a car, directly into the heating ductwork that fed into Kathy's bedroom. The ductwork was configured in such a way that the gas would flow only into her room and not into the rest of the house. As Kathy slept, carbon monoxide filled the room. She died from carbon monoxide poisoning without ever waking. After her death, Wangler called 911 and reported that his carbon monoxide detector was going off and that he felt ill. He claimed to be a victim of a faulty water heater and acted as though he had narrowly escaped death himself. Investigators arrived expecting to find a malfunctioning water heater. What they found instead was a water heater that was functioning perfectly. Forensic investigators discovered that soot was present in the heating register of Kathy's bedroom, but nowhere else in the house. The pattern proved that the gas had been directed specifically into her room. Investigators found an exhaust hose and a generator that had been recently used. When they searched the home further, they discovered journals belonging to Dr. Wangler. The journals detailed his intense anger toward Kathy and his fears about the financial consequences of a divorce. The evidence suggested that Wangler had deliberately pumped carbon monoxide into his wife's bedroom while she slept. The case required nearly 3 years of scientific testing on the home's HVAC system to prove that the gas could not have entered her room accidentally. The testing confirmed that the carbon monoxide had to have been intentionally routed into the ductwork. In September 2009, 3 years after Kathy's death, Mark Wangler was arrested. The trial began in March 2011. Prosecutors presented the scientific evidence showing that the gas had been intentionally directed into Kathy's bedroom. They highlighted Wangler's expert knowledge of gases, which he had acquired and refined over decades as an anesthesiologist. They presented the exhaust hose, the generator, and the journals that documented his anger and his financial fears. The defense attempted to argue that the death had been accidental, but the scientific evidence was too strong. The jury convicted Mark Wangler of aggravated murder. Dr. Mark Wangler was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 25 years. He is currently 68 years old and is incarcerated at Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio. He will be eligible for parole when he is approximately 76 years old. The core of this case is the weaponization of expertise. As an anesthesiologist, Wangler's entire career had been based on administering gases to unconscious patients. He used that exact skill set to murder his sleeping wife. The scientific testing of the HVAC system took nearly 3 years, but ultimately proved that the carbon monoxide had been intentionally pumped into Kathy's bedroom and nowhere else. Case 8. Dr. Amy Bishop. 40 minutes into a routine biology department faculty meeting, the Harvard-educated neurobiology professor stood up, pulled a 9mm handgun from her bag, and systematically shot 6 of her colleagues in the head. 3 died at the scene. 3 were severely wounded. Dr. Amy Bishop was 44 years old on February 12, 2010, and she was an assistant professor of biology at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. She had recently been denied tenure, which meant that her academic career at the university was over. The shooting was an act of pure retaliation. What made the case even more disturbing was that investigators later discovered Bishop had a history of violence that dated back decades. In 1986, she had shot and killed her 18-year-old brother in what was ruled an accident. In 1993, she had been a suspect in a pipe bomb incident targeting a colleague at Harvard. She had assaulted a woman at an IHOP restaurant. Academic institutions had failed to investigate her past, dazzled instead by her credentials from one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Amy Bishop Anderson was 44 years old at the time of the shooting. She held a PhD in genetics from Harvard University, one of the most respected degrees in the scientific community. She had been hired as an assistant professor of biology at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where she taught and conducted research in neurobiology. On the surface, Bishop appeared to be a successful academic, but she had a violently dark past that had been overlooked. In 1986, when she was in her early 20s, she shot and killed her 18-year-old brother with a shotgun. The death was ruled an accident at the time, though the circumstances were suspicious. In 1993, Bishop was a suspect in a pipe bomb incident at Harvard that targeted a colleague. She had also been involved in an assault on a woman at an IHOP restaurant. None of these incidents had been thoroughly investigated by the institutions that hired her. In early 2010, Bishop was denied tenure at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Tenure denial meant that her contract would not be renewed and that her academic career at the university was over. For Bishop, the denial was unacceptable. The three professors Amy Bishop killed were Dr. Gopi Padilla, 52, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, 50, and Dr. Adriel Johnson, 52. All three were highly respected biology professors and researchers at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. They were Bishop's colleagues and, in some cases, her supervisors. 3 other faculty members were shot and severely wounded, but survived. The victims were scholars and teachers who had dedicated their lives to education and research. On the morning of February 12, 2010, the biology department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville held a routine faculty meeting in the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Amy Bishop attended the meeting as usual. 40 minutes into the meeting, she stood up, reached into her bag, and pulled out a Ruger 9mm pistol. She began shooting methodically, targeting her colleagues. She shot 6 people in the head at close range. Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson were killed. 3 others were severely wounded. Survivors in the room called 911 immediately. Bishop left the building and was arrested outside the Shelby Center just minutes later. She was taken into custody without incident. The investigation into the shooting was straightforward. Bishop had been caught at the scene with the murder weapon. Witnesses had seen her shoot her colleagues. The evidence was overwhelming. But as investigators dug into Bishop's background, they discovered the violent history that had been missed by every institution that had employed her. They learned about the 1986 shooting of her brother, the 1993 pipe bomb incident, and the assault at the IHOP. Academic institutions, including Harvard and the University of Alabama in Huntsville, had failed to conduct thorough background checks, dazzled by her Ivy League credentials and her research record. The warning signs had been there for decades, but no one had acted on them. Amy Bishop was charged with capital murder and attempted murder. She initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The insanity defense was unlikely to succeed, given the premeditated nature of bringing a loaded firearm to a faculty meeting. To avoid the death penalty, Bishop accepted a plea deal in September 2012. She pleaded guilty to all charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Amy Bishop is 59 years old. She is incarcerated at Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama, where she will remain for the rest of her life. The case exposed catastrophic failures in academic hiring practices. Bishop had a violently dark past that included killing her brother, being suspected in a bombing, and assaulting a woman at a restaurant. Academic institutions repeatedly failed to vet her history, prioritizing her Harvard credentials over a thorough investigation into her background. 3 professors lost their lives, and 3 others carry permanent injuries because tenure was denied to a woman who should never have been hired in the first place. Case 9. Dr. Michael Swango, nurses at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York, noticed a terrifying pattern in 1993. Healthy patients were suddenly dying of heart attacks immediately after Dr. Michael Swango visited their rooms. The deaths were not isolated incidents. They followed a clear sequence. A patient would be admitted for a routine, non-life-threatening condition. The patient would be recovering well. Dr. Swango would enter the room. Minutes later, the patient would suffer a violent cardiac arrest and die. What made the pattern even more horrifying was that Swango had already served 5 years in prison for poisoning his paramedic co-workers with arsenic in 1985. After his release, He had managed to forge documents and credentials, and he had been hired as a physician again. Elite medical institutions, including universities and the VA, had repeatedly ignored warnings from nurses, actively concealed Swango's misconduct, and even provided him with good recommendations just to get rid of him. The cover-ups enabled a serial killer to continue practicing medicine and claiming lives across the country for more than a decade. Joseph Michael Swango was born on October 21, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington. He earned his medical degree from Southern Illinois University and worked as a physician and medical resident at hospitals, including Ohio State University and the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York. In 1985, Swango was convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his paramedic co-workers with arsenic and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. That conviction should have ended his medical career permanently. Instead, after his release, Swango forged documents and falsified credentials, and he was hired as a doctor at multiple hospitals. He had been fascinated with death, violence, and the Holocaust since childhood. He kept scrapbooks of fatal car crashes. Co-workers at the hospitals where he worked noted that he seemed incredibly excited whenever a patient coded. What they were witnessing was pathological behavior. Swango derived extreme psychological and physiological pleasure from watching people die and from being the one to pronounce them dead. At the Northport Veterans Affairs Medical Center on Long Island, 3 retired military veterans became Swango's victims. Thomas Samarco was 73 years old. George Ciano was 60. Aldo Serini was 71. All 3 were patients under Swango's care. They had been admitted to the VA hospital for routine, non-life-threatening ailments, and all 3 had been recovering well before Swango intervened. Investigators would later conclude that Swango was convicted of killing 4 patients at the VA, but they strongly suspect that he murdered as many as 60 people over the course of his career. In 1993, at the Northport Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Dr. Michael Swango killed with methodical precision. He secretly injected his patients' IV bags with massive, fatal overdoses of epinephrine, also known as adrenaline and potassium. The injections caused immediate and violent cardiac arrest. Thomas Samarco, George Ciano, and Aldo Serini were all healthy men who were recovering from routine medical issues. Swango visited their rooms. Minutes later, they were dead. The pattern was unmistakable to the nurses on the floor. They reported their observations to hospital administration. The administration did nothing. After Swango's arrest, police found hidden notebooks in his home. The notebooks detailed his joy in killing and contained formulas for various poisons. He had turned his murders into literal, documented scientific experiments. Nurses at the VA hospital could no longer ignore what they were seeing. Healthy patients were dying immediately after Dr. Swango visited their rooms. The pattern was reported, but hospital administrators chose to cover it up rather than report Swango to law enforcement. This was not the first time Swango had been protected by an institution. Multiple hospitals had quietly allowed him to resign to avoid bad press and potential lawsuits. Some had even given him positive recommendations just to ensure that he would leave and become someone else's problem. The cover-ups were systematic and deliberate, and they enabled Swango to move from hospital to hospital, killing patients at each stop. Eventually, forensic investigators exhumed bodies and found toxic levels of poisonous compounds. The notebooks Swango had kept were discovered and provided a roadmap of his crimes. By 1997, Swango was attempting to flee to a medical post in Saudi Arabia. In June 1997, he was arrested at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. He was charged with murder, assault, fraud, and making false statements. Rather than face trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Michael Swango accepted a plea deal. In September 2000, he pleaded guilty to murder charges related to his crimes at the Northport Fertility Medical Center. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dr. Michael Swango is 69 years old. He is incarcerated at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, where the most dangerous criminals in the United States are held. His inmate number is 08352-424. He will die in prison. What makes this case uniquely terrifying is not just the number of people Swango is suspected of killing, though that number is staggering. It is the fact that elite medical institutions, including universities and the Veterans Affairs system, repeatedly ignored warnings from nurses, actively concealed his misconduct, and gave him good recommendations simply to move him along. The cover-ups were deliberate, and they directly enabled a serial killer to continue practicing medicine. Investigators found a notebook in Swango's home that detailed how different poisons affected the human body. He had turned his murders into documented scientific experiments. The suspected victim count is as high as 60 people. Case 10. Richard Overton. The computer scientist was so certain of his own brilliance that he meticulously documented his crimes in complex computer code, using Russian code words and custom ciphers that he believed were unbreakable. Richard Overton was 60 years old in January 1988, and he held a PhD in psychology. He was highly skilled in computer science and mathematics, and taught at local colleges in Southern California. He was married to Janet Overton, a 46-year-old trustee on the Capistrano Unified School District Board. Janet was extremely popular, outgoing, and successful in local politics. She was also having affairs, and Richard had discovered them. He refused to divorce her. Instead, he decided to punish her and maintain his public image by killing her. For years before her death, he poisoned her with selenium, a heavy metal that caused severe lesions and hair loss. On the morning of January 24th, 1988, he laced her coffee with a lethal dose of cyanide. She collapsed in their driveway and died. The FBI eventually cracked Overton's ciphers, and the diaries he had written became the evidence that secured his conviction. Richard K. Overton was 60 years old at the time of the murder. He held a PhD in psychology and was highly skilled in computer science and mathematics. He taught at local colleges and was regarded as intelligent and accomplished. He was married to Janet Overton and lived a comfortable upper-middle-class life in Dana Point, California. Richard discovered that Janet was having affairs outside the marriage. His response was not to file for divorce, but to punish her while maintaining the appearance of a stable marriage. He was obsessed with control and with his public image. He believed that he was the smartest person in any room and that his intelligence would allow him to commit the perfect crime. As the investigation would later reveal, he kept detailed diaries of his hatred for Janet and his plans to poison her. He wrote the diaries in complex computer code, using Russian code words and custom ciphers that he was certain no one could crack. Janet Overton was 46 years old when she died. She was a trustee on the Capistrano Unified School District Board and was extremely popular in the community. She was outgoing, successful, and active in local politics. She was having affairs outside her marriage to Richard, and he had discovered them. Janet had no idea that her husband was poisoning her. She trusted him enough to drink the coffee he prepared for her each morning, and that trust cost her her life. For years before January 24th, 1988, Richard Overton had been secretly poisoning Janet with selenium, a heavy metal. The selenium poisoning caused severe lesions on her skin and significant hair loss. Janet believed she was suffering from a medical condition. She did not know that her husband was the cause. On the morning of January 24th, 1988, Richard escalated from selenium to cyanide. He laced Janet's morning coffee with a lethal dose of potassium cyanide. She drank the coffee, walked outside, and collapsed in their driveway. She died from cyanide poisoning. The initial ruling was that her death was undetermined. The case went cold. Months after Janet's death, Richard Overton's first wife, Dorothy Boyer, made a phone call to the police that would break the case open. Dorothy told investigators that Richard had previously tried to poison her with selenium in her coffee after their divorce. Based on Dorothy's tip, investigators reopened the case and re-examined Janet's tissue samples. The tests revealed lethal levels of cyanide and evidence of chronic selenium poisoning. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Richard's home. They found diaries written in complex computer code. The diaries used Russian code words and custom ciphers. Richard had believed that the codes were unbreakable and that no one would ever be able to read what he had written. The FBI brought in cryptographers. The cryptographers worked for months to crack the ciphers. Eventually, they succeeded. The diaries detailed Richard's hatred for Janet and his plans to poison her. The diaries became the most damning evidence against him. In October 1991, Richard Overton was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Richard Overton's first trial began in 1992 and ended in a mistrial when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. His second trial began in 1995. The prosecution presented the re-examined tissue samples showing cyanide and selenium, Dorothy Boyer's testimony about Richard's previous attempt to poison her, and the FBI decoded diaries that documented his hatred and his plans. The evidence was overwhelming. In May 1995, Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Richard Overton died in prison in 2009 at the age of 81. He had served approximately 14 years of his sentence. The cipher that he had believed was unbreakable became the evidence that convicted him. As an arrogant computer scientist, Richard thought he was the smartest person in any room. He meticulously documented his own crimes on early computer systems, using Russian code words and custom ciphers that he was certain would never be cracked. The FBI cracked them. His own arrogance and his need to document his brilliance led directly to his conviction. Dorothy Boyer's warning to police prevented Richard from ever walking free. Janet Overton, a successful politician and community leader, was killed by a man who wanted to punish her for leaving him emotionally while maintaining the fiction of their marriage in public.